Good day, good people. My name is Brad King, and you are listening to the Downtown Writers Jam video podcast, which is part of the Solid Listen Podcast Network. Max and Dog and I are coming to you from deep inside the jam bunker today. He just got done eating 2 bones and a bowl of food, so it's really just me. I'm excited because I have Ross Bennis on the show today, and his book, Rural Rebellion, How Nebraska Became a Republican Stronghold, which is out now, is one of my favorite kind of books. If you know me, if you've listened to the show, if you know anything about my history, you know I am from Appalachia, and this weird move to the right by Republicans, and particularly in these rural areas, is fascinating to me, both on just an intellectual level, but like as someone that cares about democracy in America, these kinds of things are really important. And he's a researcher as well as an author. So this is really an interesting conversation that we're going to have today. He's an award-winning author of 3 books, including Rural Rebellion. He has written for Entertainment Weekly, Esquire, the Lincoln Journal Star, The Nation, Omaha World Herald, Rolling Stone, the Wall Street Journal, and more. He's a native of Brainerd, Nebraska, and he cheers on the Huskers from New York. As an Ohio State fan, I find that humorous, but we will leave that for a different day. Before we get to our conversation, just a little bit of business. If you've listened to the show, you know what's coming. The Jam Proper, our hour-long show, is out every Wednesday. The video podcasts come out ish on Monday and Friday. A couple things you can do to help us out. Tell your friends about us. That is the best way for us to spread the word. Everybody's back to the gym and they're driving. They're looking for things to keep them occupied. So you should tell them about us. And leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This is particularly important if you have an iPhone or an iPad. Head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a written review. You can also pop over to our Facebook page, leave us a review there, or you can head over to the website, thewritersjam.com, and leave us a testimonial through the contact page. While you're there, a couple things you can do. You can check out this video podcast series. You can buy any of the books of people that have been on the show by clicking on that bookshop link. You're looking for a book to read, click our book review section, or you can just sign up for the newsletter, and all of that stuff comes into your mailbox once a month. You can also support the entire Solid Listen podcast network by clicking on the Patreon button. For just a couple bucks a month, you'll get all kinds of special content from everybody across the network. It's fantastic. You should do that right now. So Ross and I have this conversation about why he wrote this book because, as you'll hear, this is it is the same that he's done in the past in that he takes a deep dive into topics, but local politics in Nebraska was not something that he started to write about or that he thought he was going to write about. So I find that interesting, but I've been around researchers enough to know like most of my life has been covering science, technology, dealing with scientists and people that do basic research and things like that. And when somebody gets a question in their head, when one of these people get a question in their head, they will go deep into it in the way that the public, me included, don't always go, right? Like we sort of, even if we drill down a little bit, we don't generally go as deep as people that are doing hardcore research. And so that kind of thing is really important. In fact, over the next few weeks, I have several different kinds of researchers that are coming onto the show to talk about whatever topic it is they're looking at, because I think that as someone who was both a magazine writer, magazines take deep dives into things, but when you do that, even as an author, when you do that, the deeper you go into a topic, the more you realize that you're not an expert on a thing. And that's weird because you're also writing about it. So you're writing about a thing that like you're not an expert on, but you're trying to explain it to people. And it's this really interesting dichotomy that happens. And so when I can get somebody on the show who actually is a writer and does the research and sort of has their head wrapped around stuff, I'm always really excited. So you should be too. You should go out and get this book. It is in the vein of What's the Matter with Kansas. It's that kind of book. Ross is from Nebraska, obviously. So this is both personal and political, not to co-opt that term, but that's sort of what this book is. And I'm really excited for you to hear the conversation. I'm really excited to pick up the book and read it. I appreciate you guys taking time out of your day to come spend a little time with Max and I here in the bunker. I hope that your day is going well. I hope that you are taking care of each other, and I hope that you are finding your way back into the world. And I hope for the next half hour, you will sit back and enjoy my conversation with Roth Dennis. I was looking at the 3 books that you had done, and they're like, this book is obviously very different than the first 2 books, except for that it's sort of not, right? Like a large part of what you do is research, is like deep dives into specific topics to sort of understand what a thing is, or why a thing is the way that it is. How did you settle on switching from the first 2 books to Nebraska and looking at the politics of where you're from?
Yeah, I suppose 2 sex research books and then a Nebraska politics book doesn't seem like the most logical progression. And you're right that they are similar and that they both utilize various genres and they are research driven, kind of like academia for general audiences.
Yeah.
I wasn't planning on doing a Nebraska politics book initially. After I did the second sex book, I was working on a book about low culture, stuff like pro wrestling, which I'm really into. And it was after the election of Donald Trump that I pivoted, because I had so many conversations with people about that topic who didn't know any Trump voters, because I work in media and I live in Brooklyn. So I'm like in a very liberal enclave within a liberal enclave. And when they find out I'm from this small town in Nebraska where people tend to be conservative, there was this huge fascination there. And I noticed that towns like my hometown started getting a lot more press coverage, but it was usually just like cursory. There's just like, it's just like a surface level type stuff. And people were kind of depicted as like either they were a conspiracy theorist or they were a coal miner, or there's about 3 or 4 different types of Trump voters that you saw in news stories. And the people I grew up with weren't like any of those. So I decided to write a book about it. And I also was just really fascinated by how much my home state had changed. I thought it was worth documenting. We've always been a conservative state, but after the election of Trump, I looked back and I started analyzing our local officials too, and realizing just how much they were different from the Republicans and moderate Democrats we elected, when I was a child. So it's a remarkable shift. And I thought this is the time to do it. If I'm ever going to write about my hometown, this is the time to do it. And I wrote a politics book that I never thought I would have done.
Yeah. I'm from a small Appalachian town in Ohio, and my family sort of documented back to the 1300s, because we're like the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of American history. Like, we just sort of keep showing up in all these places, but never in a good way. And I had the same thing. Like, I actually threw the book out and restarted it after 2016 because it was such a fundamental shift. Like, I grew up around what I like to call like rational Republicans. Like, most of my family they were conservative, and I didn't agree with them on anything, but like, they were not crazy. Like, there wasn't this sort of QAnon thing. And even still, my family never really bought into that new stuff. And so when I see people sort of talking about these areas, I'm like, that doesn't really jive with what I saw. I get the analysis, but it didn't really jive with what I saw. And that's been a really weird reckoning to like sort of try to explain what that means. So how do you go about explaining what that means? Because it's such a big question, and like, it involves history and politics and sociopolitics and the founding of America. There's like everything built into this explanation.
Well, I started with a very personal side because I wanted to talk about being in that town for most of my life. So this book was much more personal than my other 2, which weren't really memoir driven at all. And I wanted to explore this paradox of the people I grew up with. I tend to think, even if I disagree with them on 9 out of 10 political issues, I tend to think of them as very nice, good people who will do the right thing, usually like in a social interaction with a person. Yet they've enabled some of the like worst people we've put into office in the last 100 years. And there's a lot to unpack there. So I started with the personal side, like what I saw in that town, what made conservative viewpoints seem more logical to me then than I feel they are now when I live in this liberal enclave in a large city. And then I wanted to layer on the research, and There, I tried to interview like every major political figure our states had during my lifetime and get their points on it and see like what they experienced as their own parties had changed. So talking to a lot of former or a lot of even current Republicans, but people who were in office recently. And I also, dived into the academic research too. So it's a lot to unpack, but the personal is probably the first thing. And that's easier to do though on some topics. Like if I want to talk about abortion or healthcare, which are big political issues, I could talk about my experiences with those issues and what the viewpoint was in Brainerd versus um, Brooklyn, New York. But then when you want to talk about how the political parties changed, that's where I struggle with the personal because I don't have a strong history of being an activist in a party or being involved with the state legislature or anything like that. So that's where it had to be like third person research driven because it's not like I spent every day of my life, attending the legislative sessions or
Yeah.
anything. That's where I leaned on interviews and research.
So let me ask, because one of the issues that as I've been writing about this, is that for me, like as I've sort of struggled putting this thing together, is it's like I have a lens of my small town, a 5,000 person. It's a small, 5, 10,000 people. It's a very small place. And so it wasn't until I left, right? Like I'm wearing my Berkeley shirt. Like I went to Berkeley. I lived in Austin. I lived in Boston. I've lived in blue areas. And that was when I began to become, not that I wasn't aware of race and sexuality and things like that. But again, that was not the lens into which I viewed my town. And it wasn't until I left and was like, oh my God, like even my perception of what this place is a very simple myopic view, because the rest of the world that doesn't look and sound like me has a totally different experience with towns like the one that I grew up in. Like, as you were writing, how did you struggle with those issues of race and gender and sexuality and how you viewed what had changed?
Yeah, well, I put the most race discussion is in the chapter I have on immigration. So that's where it came up the most. And for that, I went to there are other small towns in Nebraska that aren't like mine,
Yeah.
where they're most of them are almost entirely white. I mean
Yeah.
that's the most commonplace small town in those areas. But there are towns that have changed a lot and have had many immigrants in them, and I focused on those towns instead of my hometown on that chapter because they're then affected by the you know voting on immigration. Like uh, in my town, I think people didn't view it as much in racial terms, even if that's how their votes effectively were, because they're so isolated,
Right.
and they don't ever you don't ever come into contact with anyone
Right.
who isn't white, so you probably aren't even thinking that it's a racial thing. You're just voting for some legal precept of being against illegal immigration. But when
Yeah.
you go to a town that has a meatpacking plant and they've seen their demographics change dramatically, when a law like that goes into effect, it has a huge impact on humans' lives in that town. And that's how I dealt with it in that issue. Um, but it is tough though, because I do want to criticize the people I grew up with for who they've put in office and some of these policies they've enacted, which are very oppressive to immigrants. But I also don't want to just be like a snob to them and look down on them and say, well, look, since I moved away, I'm so much smarter than you. You're just a bunch of, backwater hillbillies. Because that approach has been utilized by other authors.
It
So I
has,
try to
but
be sympathetic.
as again, like as someone who's from that area, like I think that's a false dichotomy, right? Like there's a multitude of ways to present those. And like I've had to deal, my family, while they were Democrats and they fought on the side of the Union, like, I mean, they had slaves, right? And like this obviously goes back to the 1800s, but like even as I dealt with the people into today, like for me it's been a struggle because I have the natural inclination that everybody does, I think, which is, well, like I sort of understand them and I want to make sure I'm fair. But then there's this other part of me that's like, yeah, but like we also have to talk about the shit that we did, right? Like the shit that
Mm-hmm.
went on in those places, that is like that I find is the big struggle with writing about stuff, because people always talk about the way media portrays stuff, but like you're like me, you're from that place. Like the fact that you happen to write for a major media thing now doesn't mean you're a big media person because you come from that area. So did you find yourself with that push and pull sort of struggling of like, okay, like how do I tell a truth that may sting them, but that needs to be
Mhm.
told, but that isn't coming at it from, you know, a fly and somebody who's dropping in and they're like, well, how could they live like this? And you're like, well, there's a lot of reasons why people live like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of religion discussion in the book,
Oh,
particularly
interesting.
in abortion chapter,
Yeah.
because I think it's had a huge effect on our national politics, but also state politics. And I have had some people email me from Nebraska who believed I was too critical of the church, and that they didn't think the church was political as I made it out to be. But that was my experience, and I know they don't like to hear that, but I felt that was a true thing that's happening. And if you didn't think the church was being very overtly political in a mostly conservative way, I think people have their ears closed. So, and I'd written about that before for some like Esquire and Deadspin. So it wasn't the first time I did it, but I expanded upon it significantly um, in the book. But I know that discussion is going to anger people in my own diocese to a degree,
Yeah.
but I felt that it had to be said though, because it's just the reality of the situation there. And a lot of the onus and the blame I put is more on the, like, bishops, or even when it's from a partisan point of view, more on the Republican Party itself than just the individual people who are in the pews, because I think they tend to follow those leaders, and those leaders don't have to take that direction. I mean, there's
Yeah.
kind of a chicken and egg situation there, but
Yeah, one of the things that has, like, I've read a lot. I grew up reading a lot of bell hooks. Like that was she was writing about this stuff before you and I were ever writing about this stuff, right? And I do find it interesting that, again, having come from a small place but lived in big places, the difference between sort of the personal interactions that happen in that town, right? Because in my town, and I'm assuming in your town as well, um, I would see people being racist as a kid, like that would, like that I now recognize. I'm like, oh, this thing that they said or whatever is not right. Um, and yet everybody still lived together and everybody was still around each other. And it's the sort of, and then I went to the city and it's like, you don't know anybody because you live in New York City, right? There's 3, 4,
yeah,
5 million people there. And there becomes this different level of what those sort of toxic things, I use race, but any of the toxic things that happen that allow these discussions to happen. I find that dynamic in my life really interesting. Like the difference between these small towns where you sort of know everybody and these big places where you sort of don't. Like, did you struggle with any of that, or did you touch on any of that in the book in an overt way?
mm. What I touched on though a lot in the book though too is the small town life, because you have to deal with people you interact
Yeah,
with. They tend to treat the people they deal with better. Like I get yelled at more for random stuff, here in New
yeah,
York by someone who I'll never see again,
yeah,
than I would, if I could live in a small town for years.
yeah. That's
Because
what I mean. It's the impersonal nature of
yeah,
whatever anger or hate you have in a
y-
city can spew out in a way that in a small town it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen as you're walking down the street. Right?
yeah. Well, no, no, what I wrote about in the book is, in small town, on the surface, there's a great sense of community. People are friendlier because they have an incentive to be. But this resentment will bubble up at times, even in this, like, quaint little
Yeah,
way of life they have. It'll bubble up if you're getting drunk with people in the garage, and they start to like really let loose on something that they've been holding in, and it bubbles up in the ballot box, like uh, you know, really proudly voting for some um, reactionary person, when if you saw the interactions that these people have in the normal day to day, you may not predict that they would feel that way,
yeah.
but
And
they
I know
do.
for me it's been a precipitous, again, like my immediate family has not. I am, I knock wood all the time. Like they're conservative, but like they've sort of stayed in that Reagan conservative realm of like sort of early Reagan, right? Like before the sort of Christian coalition really coalesced. And I understand people's disagreement with that part of the party, but like it was always a rational, like I understood why they felt that way. And then this other part of my town has become absolutely part of the cult, right? Like they're not Republicans, they are Trumpsters. And it's a different thing.
Yeah.
It's a different experience because they're not even talking about things that the conservatives that I knew talked about. They're in places that I have a hard time understanding, and I'm from there. Like I know how you grew up. Like nothing you're saying is true. Like I know it to not be true from your experience. Like as you were writing, did you find yourself wrestling with those kinds of like the difference between sort of traditional conservatives and this like new version of Trump Q stuff?
Yeah, no, that there was definitely a division there. Uh, and it's tough to capture it in a unique way. That's where I leaned on interviews a lot, because I would interview like U.S. senator from Nebraska who served in the 90s, who was a Republican, who would say that for like that person actually has uh, a viewpoint on that issue that's really unique and powerful. And if like 1990s Republicans are looking liberal in comparison and saying we don't know what happened to our party, that says something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Reagan could get elected in the Republican Party today.
Yeah, well, I don't think Eisenhower, a lot of those
But
traditionally.
Reagan is the one that everybody sort of recently points to as like he was the greatest president of, and now I'm like, your party wouldn't even reelect him or even get him through the. He'd talk about immigrants coming here and like that'd be the end of his candidacy.
Yeah, well, just to give you an example of how it has changed, this is like something I spelled in the book, is um, conservatives I knew were, like you said, there would be a logical philosophy. One of the tenets is local control.
Yeah.
So let's say they don't like government overreach of like the federal government telling states what to do, states what to tell municipalities what to do. Well, in Nebraska during COVID, the Omaha City Council wanted to pass a mask ordinance. They wanted to be proactive, stop the spread of this virus. And the Republican governor said, we don't need to tell people what to do. I and the attorney general will sue the city of Omaha if you try to pass it. So then they didn't pass it. And for the next like 3 months, this is like a year ago when things are really, really dire, they didn't have a mask ordinance in the state's largest city. And that's a direct violation of a true conservative philosophy, because local control would be the city council deciding what the city should do.
Yeah.
The governor saying that you can't do that is the exact sort of thing that they say they hate. And so that's a Trumpy type of move. That's just like a, silly reactionary thing. And that's what that party has become. I don't call it, it's not conservative as like you would traditionally define it. It's not like Dwight D. Eisenhower or any of that.
Yeah. I mean, there truly is a Republican Party and a Trump Party. And watching, again, my small town sort of divide amongst that. And you see Ohio, which was once sort of reliably a purple place, where it was sort of a bellwether that you could say, well, this is going to be is now very reliably a Republican and leaning Trump kind of place. And it is unrecognizable to me in a lot of places. And I spent, a large part of my life there. And it was one of the reasons that I, when we first started talking, I was like, oh yeah, like these kinds of books I think are really important, because magazine articles don't really cut, like, unless you get a New Yorker 25,000 word, cover story, and there's one of those. It's really hard to delve into this topic in anything other than, there's not a Rick Bragg anymore who has space in the New York Times to just say, well, I'm going to go into these small towns and write about them. And so spending a book length on that, I think, is very interesting in a not sort of, not like, Sarah's flyover. It's not an analysis of the media and the way people look at it. It is literally like, this is one little small place, and here's what I saw. That seems like an interesting perspective, and one that like we all need to be. And I don't even know if the world at large needs it so much as like people like us need it. Like people that are from those areas, I think, need to like really have a reckoning with each other.
Yeah. And like you said, it's just one little place. I use the approach of, this is what I knew.
Yeah.
It's very specific. It's a specific time, specific place. But what's happening there has happened in a lot of places. So use
Everywhere.
that local example to show the craziest. Like I mentioned, the mask ordinance. There's
Yeah.
been
How much can
there's a
I
lot
ask?
of stuff like that.
Can I ask how much have you gone back? Like, so for me, part of the reason that I want to write the book is so that I can go back into the area that I'm from and have these discussions with the
Yeah.
people that I grew up with, right? Like, I don't need to send it to my friends at Berkeley. Like, they need to learn some stuff about that, but like they sort of understand. But I feel like some of that problem is in those local towns is that people have left and they don't have the kinds of discussions that this book is bringing up. Like, how
And
much?
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I even mentioned the book that I'm part of the problem, like brain drain, and
Yeah,
then
me too.
when people in small towns have become more hostile to or conservatives in general have become more hostile to higher education, the benefits of the people who have benefited from higher education in those towns have often left.
Yeah.
Like I got a degree from the University of Nebraska. I had a pleasant experience. If I was at the bar and someone was saying, "Oh, it's a leftist indoctrination camp," it'd be someone like me who would say, "Well, actually, it was a very pleasant experience, and my professors,
Right.
while they may be liberal, like they just wanted people to participate and they weren't trying to indoctrinate anyone." But I'm not there, and many of my friends who feel that way aren't there because we used our degrees and we moved to Denver and
Right.
Minneapolis and places like that.
Yeah.
I'm in New York City, so it's a
Austin,
huge
Berkeley.
problem.
Yeah. Like all the places I went. Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to have conversations with my friends. It's been tougher during COVID. Before COVID,
Yeah.
this is about a 3-year project, this book, and the other like 2 years I would go back for a week or two twice a year. So we're looking, I'd be in Nebraska for probably between like 2 to 5 weeks
Yeah.
a year, and I would see family. I would be going there anyways, but then I'd
Yeah.
also do a lot of reporting and have these conversations. Now we're in a weird situation where I have a book about Nebraska out, and this is the longest I've ever gone without visiting it because of COVID. I'm visiting it in like 2 weeks. It's been well over a year now. I don't normally go that long. I hope to have some conversations like that, and I'm sure there's been some coffee talk at the bar about it because there's not a lot of people releasing books
Yeah.
in that area. So maybe it's generated some discussion. I'm curious to see if they're going to just dismiss me as like, oh, he's an elitist now.
Yeah. He's left. Yeah.
Yeah. I grew up in the town of 300, and my dad's a plumber, and I got Pell Grants to go to a state university, but I'm sure I'm an elitist now to some people.
I've told the story on the program, like I played baseball for a long time. And like from the very early age, my nickname was the professor. And I've told folks that was a pejorative. that was not a,
they were calling you an egghead, right?
Yeah. Cause I was always reading a book on the bus or wherever we were going. I'd shoot the shit, but like, also I'm like, I'm going to go read this book. And they're like, the professor's at it again. And like, but it's also why, and I think, we'll wrap it up with this, is that I've told people I can also go back, because no matter what they say to me, I grew up there. Like, I know all these people. I'm like, you literally can't say shit to me. And that, yeah, you can insult me, but like, you lived in my basement for 3 years. Like, what are you talking about? Like, me. And I find that like when I go home, there's a bar, and like a lot of my classmates will send out a Facebook email and people show up. And the conversations that we have in person are so different than the shit that you see on Facebook and Twitter.
Oh, totally different.
It's amazing, different. Right? It's amazing.
It's a lot harder to just antagonize someone and throw them under the bus and call them some generic pejorative when you're face to face, especially if you know the person.
That's what I mean. Like, we've all known each other since we were 5 years old. Like, what are you gonna say to me? Come on. Particularly when I know like your kids are at college. Like, shut up.
Yeah.
And I think I guess what I get at with these books and stuff is that it's important for people outside of those regions to read them, but it's equally as important for people like us to make sure we keep going back to those places and having those conversations, because it's you and I are the ones. We're the face and the voice of the people that can go safely to those areas and have that conversation.
Yeah.
Right. Like, that's not other people's discussion, because they can't come in and do it. Because otherwise, shit, if you moved into my town, I don't know if this is the way it was with you, but like and you were 10 years old, you're still an outsider to this day.
Yeah. And they're distrustful of media. So if someone from the Times wanted to stop in my town Like they're not going to get a
No,
deep personal story from him.
no, they're not getting shit. Well, listen, it was great talking to you. I'm excited to read this book. It's called Rural Rebellion. It's out now, yeah?
Yep. Yep. So,
Any place where people buy books online these days until everything opens up again.
yep. That's what I say. I tell them bookshop is better than Amazon if you have to do online.
Yes, that is where I promote everywhere, or like, and use Bookshop to find your local bookstore and buy it
Yep.
through their bookshop link.
Yep.
Well, listen, it was great talking to you. I can't wait to read the book, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us.
Hey, but I love chatting with you too, Brad.
That was Ross Bennis. His book, Rural Rebellion, How Nebraska Became a Republican Stronghold, is out right now. Before we get out of here, just a couple reminders. If you like what you heard, do us those 2 favors we talked about at the top of the show. First, tell your friends about us. Second, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and particularly if you have an iPhone or iPad on Apple Podcasts. While you're at it, don't forget to check out the other programs on the Solid Listen Podcast Network, including the flagship Mother May I Sleep With podcast with host and our Solid Listen podcast queen, Molly McLear. Don't forget, we have these video podcasts coming out sporadically on the Solid Listen Network YouTube channel, generally Mondays and Fridays, and you can always catch the audio wherever you listen to podcasts. And the Jam proper is out every Wednesday, so get yourself subscribed so you never miss an episode. And remember, you can always catch us on Twitter and Instagram at The Writers Jam. Until the next time, I will see you around the internet.